Ravi Sharma, Argument and Design in Plato's Hippias Minor.
Thank you, Don, and thanks everyone for attending. As Don just mentioned, my work on the Hippias Minor stems from a book project that I'm doing. I'm producing a volume for Oxford containing a philological commentary, a translation, and an extended interpretation of the dialogue with a discussion of associated works by other Socratic writers. I'm presently in an advanced stage of the project, or so I hope, so stay tuned. It should not be too long. Today, I'm going to keep my talk to about 40 minutes so that we'll have ample time for discussion. And I'm also going without handouts. I'll just share a bit of material in the chat, but please do let me know if anybody has any issues with that, and we'll work something else out. Okay, as you know from the abstract, I want to discuss the first dialectical argument of Hippias Minor. You may recall that the first argument is motivated by a question that Socrates poses near the dialogue's outset regarding which Homeric hero is better, Achilles or Odysseus. Hippias opts for Achilles, characterizing Odysseus as polytropos, wily or devious. In discussing what he means by that term, Hippias also goes on to describe Odysseus as polytropos te kai pseudes, wily and a false speaker. And Socrates then zeroes in on the term pseudes, which becomes the focus of the first argument. The argument's goal is to refute what Hippias takes to be an obvious truth about the false speaker. It's articulated at 365c of the dialogue as a possible view of Homer's. And here, I'll put this passage, this line in the chat so you can take a look at it. Socrates says, "So it would seem that Homer thought the truthful person was different from the false one and not the same." Hippias assumes responsibility for that thesis, and the argument then gets underway. Just how the thesis should be understood is going to need comment as we interpret the argument, and so too for the alternative that Socrates will defend. So let me start by giving you a rough and minimally interpreted sketch of the argument, which I'll go on to refine by considering some common objections. That will ultimately lead me to some remarks on the larger goal of the argument, which will occupy the last third or so of my discussion. To remind you of how the argument goes, Hippias agrees that false speakers like Odysseus are capable, junatoi, especially when it comes to deception, and in that sense are wily. About their capacity, two things are emphasized. First, it is intellectual in nature. The wily operate by a form of intelligence, albeit one that's negatively valenced, characterizable as scheming, panorgia. Second, it's closely allied with the capacity to speak falsely, to say what is false whenever one wishes to do so, provided, of course, that there are no obstacles that would hinder one's performance, a sudden bout of illness or the like. On the basis of those agreements, Socrates considers examples of expertise in several domains of knowledge: calculation, geometry, and astronomy, in order to argue that just as the capacity to speak truly at will is a function of mastering a domain, so too is the capacity reliably to speak falsely. Put differently, the capable and wise person, when it comes to false speaking in a certain domain, is just the expert, the same person who can tell the truth. Socrates' conclusion is then that it is the same person, the expert, who is capable of speaking both falsely and truly, and thus Hippias's original claim cannot stand. So much for the sketch. The argument has satisfied very few readers of the dialogue. Against it, two main objections have been raised. I want to take them up one by one and address each of them in some detail. So here goes. First of all, many scholars have charged that the argument confuses the ability to lie and the disposition to do so. In a paper that's widely cited in the English language literature, Mulhern pressed an influential version of the objection by maintaining that the argument equivocates on key terms. According to him, when the term palutropos is initially introduced in the dialogue to describe Odysseus, this is around 364c of the dialogue, it's introduced as an ability term without any character implications. Mulhern translates it resourceful. However, when Hippias subsequently wants to mark a contrast between the characters of Odysseus and Achilles, he does so by describing Odysseus with an expression that I've already noted, palutropos tekai pseudes. The latter term, pseudes, is a negative character term, and in using the former together with it, Hippias implicitly alters the sense of palutropos to mean wily or cunning, terms which Mulhern takes to be descriptions of character. Hippias thus muddles the distinction between ability terms and character terms, and as the first argument gets underway, Socrates and Hippias equivocate recklessly on the other term, pseudes, so that it corresponds to the first, the ability sense of the term palutropos. The equivocation then makes nonsense out of the resulting argument. Even scholars who don't rely on the specifics of that diagnosis often hold that the argument is fallacious for the same basic reason as does Mulhern. Socrates establishes that the truthful person and the false speaker share an ability, but in drawing his conclusion, he puzzlingly and misleadingly speaks as if he has shown that they share a disposition. As Kant succinctly puts the matter, the examples cited show that anyone who can lie well about any matter will also be able to tell the truth on the same subject. But to conclude, therefore, that the same person lies and tells the truth is not only fallacious, but obviously false. That's the objection. So in responding, let me begin with Mulhern's charge of equivocation, which is still some 54 years later, the only diagnosis of which I know for the purported mistake that Socrates and Hippias make. The charge is not, in fact, supported by the text. That's my basic response. Mulhern's idea that the term palutropos initially means resourceful depends on an erroneous suggestion that Hippias is trying to capture Homeric usage in what he says about Achilles, Nestor, and Odysseus at 364c of the dialogue. The presumption is that, of course, that in Homer, resourceful is at least one meaning of the term palutropos. Hippias is doing no such thing. He's not trying to capture Homeric usage. The term sophotatos, which he uses of Nestor, is not Homeric, since the positive term sophos does not even occur in Homer. And despite what some interpreters have supposed, the term Aristos, as used of Achilles, does not directly commend his bravery, as one might expect if the usage were Homeric, but it merely signals that he is the best of the heroes, thus answering Socrates' question about the relative merits of Achilles and Odysseus. I'm happy to talk further about that in the question period if anyone would like. But the upshot is that I think palutropos is best understood in that passage and throughout to mean devious or wily, as interpreters have in fact commonly supposed. And thus understood, the term suggests a skill of some sort and may fairly be characterized as an ability term, but the ability is crucially one with decidedly negative character implications. When Hippias subsequently describes Odysseus as palutropos tekai pseudes, he is not changing his use of the former term, polytropos, but is merely making explicit its implication for character. Given what I've just said, I want to pause for a moment to address Rosalind Weiss's influential contention that even the term pseudes is used here early in the dialogue as an ability notion without implications for character, and that there's no equivocation in the dialogue's first argument simply because we have no character terms at issue anywhere in it. Professor Weiss's work on the dialogue is among the very best that's been done, but I don't think this thesis can be right. As you may remember from the dialogue, Hippias uses a quotation from Book 9 of the Iliad to support his judgment of Achilles and Odysseus. He quotes the point in the embassy scene from Book 9 where Achilles says, crucially, "Hateful to me as the gates of Hades is that person who hides one thing in his heart but speaks another." And he, of course, takes Achilles to be speaking to and of Odysseus. Weiss suggests that this is not meant to offer an evaluation of Odysseus's character. I disagree, but let me just say for now that any idea that Hippias does not regard the quotation as justifying a judgment of Odysseus's character is contradicted directly by Hippias's own assessment of Homer's words. Hippias says, in these verses, he shows the character of each man. Hippias makes clear that he is offering an appraisal of Odysseus's character and that he takes the appraisal to be encapsulated by Achilles' words. So I do think that the term pseudes is a character term here and throughout. To return to my main point, nothing about these early passages of the dialogue suggests that Socrates and Hippias are somehow confusing ability terms and character terms. Nor, I submit, does Socrates make such a confusion anywhere in the following argument. Let's consider again the way Socrates describes the thesis he's going to oppose. So this is the line that I put in the chat at 365C. He says that, Socrates says that Homer would seem, on Hippias's interpretation, to have thought that the truthful person is different from the false one and not the same. What Socrates takes Hippias to be ascribing to Homer, I suggest, is not the truism that the person with the character of a false speaker is a different person from the one with the character of a truth teller. It's instead that the two are different in cognitive or intellectual type, in the sense that anyone who counts as a truth teller lacks the cognitive ability qualifying someone as a false speaker. So much has emerged clearly from Hippias's characterization of Odysseus, according to which Odysseus has a remarkable ability, but one that is oriented toward wrongdoing. Indeed, what makes Achilles good, according to Hippias, is a total lack of that ability, since Achilles is unfailingly straightforward, haplous, or as Hippias also says later, pseudes, without falsehood. By contrast, Socrates will be arguing that the same cognitive ability underlies both sorts of character, that of the truthful and better person, as well as that of the capable false speaker. To that extent, and to that extent alone, they are the same. Do Socrates' other statements of his position bear out that proposal? As mentioned, Socrates develops his position with regard to three examples: calculation, geometry, and astronomy. The first one is treated at length and the latter two only briefly. Socrates begins by arguing that given Hippias's experience in calculation, Hippias will best be able to respond truthfully to questions falling under that skill. What's more, he will best be able to respond falsely to the same questions. After going on to stress that the false speaker in matters of calculation is to be considered junatos pseudosthai, Socrates works his way to the following generalization, and I'll put this in the chat as well. This passage is from 367c of the dialogue, if anyone is following along with the text. Socrates says, so the same person is most capable of saying false and true things about matters of calculation, and that is the person who's good at those matters, the expert in calculation. Here in this remark, he's using the same person, that phrase generically. He's speaking of any person who, like Hippias, is a master of logistike. Then he goes on, then who proves false in matters of calculation, Hippias, other than the person who is good? Because the same person is also capable, and it is this person who likewise proves truthful. The second remark takes the figure of the expert and points out that such a person's capacity underlies instances of the behavior of both false speaker and truth teller. To say as much as not to imply that the same individual may somehow have opposing character traits. In the lead up to this remark, Socrates has made no suggestion to that effect, and he has in fact been at pains not to say anything that would saddle Hippias, who serves as his sample expert, with a disposition to speak falsely. All of the things he says about Hippias in the relevant passage in the lead up here are clearly marked as hypothetical in character. Instead, his final comment about the truthful person, houtos dekai alethes, should be taken as an observation that such a person, like the false speaker, is both good at calculation, and capable. A similar reading can easily be given to what follows in the argument, but there is a potential problem passage at the end of the argument as a whole. When Socrates sums up his results, he says the following, and let me put this passage in the chat as well for you. Okay. Socrates says, you are aware, you said that Achilles is truthful while Odysseus is a false speaker and devious. And then he goes on, do you see now that the same type of person has plainly been shown to be a false speaker and truthful? So if your position was that Odysseus is a false speaker, he also turns out to be truthful? And if your position was that Achilles is truthful, he also turns out to be a false speaker, and the two men are not different from one another nor opposed, but the same. What's said here about Odysseus and Achilles is at first glance puzzling and has puzzled many interpreters. Can we read it so as to avoid any suggestion that the same person has contrary dispositions? I think we can. What we may take Socrates to mean is, if Hippias held that Odysseus was a false speaker in virtue of being polytropos, the skill that supposedly underlies his disposition and that Socrates has just referred to, then Odysseus is equally qualified to be considered truthful. And Achilles, whom Hippias held to be truthful without supplying any description of an underlying capacity, may now just as well be said to be a false speaker, since it has become clear that the requisite background capacity is in each case the same. That approach offers a better reading of the passage than any suggestion that Socrates holds each Homeric hero to somehow possess contrary dispositions, or that he confuses disposition and character for no reason right at the end of his argument. Socrates' way of speaking here is simply meant to highlight the fact that Hippias has said nothing that could ground different estimates of the characters of the two heroes, and nothing, therefore, that could warrant the claim that Achilles is best. Because Socrates has undermined the whole idea that Odysseus and Achilles are utterly opposed in Antiotata, then so far as concerns what Hippias has said, the character he ascribes to one figure might readily be swapped for what he says of the other. From Socrates' point of view, Hippias has failed to understand the nature of the expertise that would lie behind any intentional moral wrongdoing, and correlatively has failed to understand the nature of moral goodness. All right, that's what I have to say in response to the first objection I raised regarding the argument. That's by far the most common one, but there's also a second one that has occasionally been raised, and I want to turn to it now. An aspect of it will prove, I think, much more troubling and will necessitate some further discussion about the dialogue. Here's the objection. Even if the argument is valid, it's largely beside the point. It considers truth-telling and false speaking in contexts of expertise, but it does not consider the false speaker in everyday situations. Without a mastery of any specific domain, one can speak falsely and effectively about, say, where one was the previous night and with whom one spent one's time. Because of the argument's one-sided focus, it ignores the fundamental ability of the false speaker, which is akin to the ability of an orator to read an uninformed audience and offer a persuasive appeal. And therefore, the argument fails as an analysis of false speaking and as an attempt to demonstrate an identity between the skill of the false speaker and that of the truthful person. I think we can separate out two versions of this objection. One is easier to deal with than the other. So let me first address the easier one. The easier version is this. Socrates' discussion of false speaking is too narrow because it misses the most common and obvious case of false speaking, the most common and obvious kind of case, the one that occurs in everyday contexts. One might address the objection as follows. The idea that the conversation is misleadingly narrow depends on a background assumption, namely that Socrates is out to define the term pseudes. He is not. Were that his concern, it would simply be wrong-headed from the outset for him and Hippias to suppose that all false speakers are wily, where that involves thinking they are skilled at what they do and act with a measure of intelligence. The idea that Socrates is offering a definition may arise partly from a tendency to assimilate what's going on here to what is at issue in some of the other Platonic dialogues. If so, it is worth noting that Socrates never asks a definitional question in the lead up to the present argument and never expresses puzzlement as to what is meant by the term pseudes. Indeed, he finds it illuminating when Hippias uses that term to gloss his use of polytropos, which Socrates at first says he does not understand. Instead of being definitional, the discussion is focused squarely only on false speakers of a certain sort, ones who are adept at deception in the fashion of Odysseus. And Socrates purports to be examining Hippias as to whether or not a false speaker of that sort is the same in type as the truthful person. That is to say, whether the false speaker has the same type of skill. However, the second and more difficult version of the objection is that being skilled in deception need have nothing to do with a mastery of the content of various areas of inquiry. Even if a mastery of content is crucial to successful false speaking and hence deceiving in domains of expertise, one can also be skilled at deceiving in perfectly ordinary contexts. That's because the ability that's really crucial in deception has to do with reading people and catering to their expectations or playing upon their desires and fears. Yet Socrates does not address this manipulative ability and so misses the point. Indeed, in the early going of the argument, Hippias raises the idea of a capacity for deception, but as the discussion goes on, Socrates speaks instead of being capable at false speaking, which he does from 366b of the dialogue onward. I propose that the proper response here is to acknowledge the validity of the objection, but to deflect the point that the objector may think it implies, namely that Plato does not know what he is doing or that his character Socrates is confused as to what he's about. I want to take the author and the character separately, so let me start with Plato, the author, and make some observations that will speak to what I think he is doing. As I've just described the objection, the capacity centrally at issue in deception is reminiscent of the persuasive ability assigned to Gorgias in the eponymous dialogue. It may therefore be of some interest that Hippias Minor has a close dramatic link with the opening and early conversation of Plato's Gorgias. So far as I can tell, this has been missed entirely in the tradition of secondary literature on the two dialogues. So here's a list drawn from the material for my book, and I'm going to take this bit by bit. So first of all, both dialogues begin with Socrates having failed to engage with an epideixis, a display speech by a visiting sophist. In the Gorgias, of course, he has missed the speech. In Hippias Minor, he's been present, but has remained silent. Both dialogues then take the form of a Socratic examination before an audience lingering after the display speech. And in both dialogues, again, this is all in the chat, it's a companion of Socrates who plays a mediating role with respect to the visiting sophist. In the Gorgias, the companion is Chaerephon, and Gorgias doesn't enter the conversation until Chaerephon addresses him, and Gorgias may or may not have heard what went on before, depending on how one reads the drama. So too for Hippias Minor, the companion is Eutychus. Hippias does not enter the conversation until Eutychus addresses him, and Hippias may or may not have heard what went on before. The idea that Eutychus is a Socratic, I should say, has gone almost entirely unrecognized in the literature, as I remark in the chat. I'll return in just a moment to my reason for thinking that he is a Socratic, but just bear with me. Next, in each case, the companion of Socrates refers to Euripides in explaining how to remedy Socrates' initial failure of engagement. For the Gorgias, I refer to Dodds's commentary. Dodds points out that there's a very likely reference to Euripides' lost play concerning Telephus near the outset of the Gorgias. In Hippias Minor, Eutychus adapts a passage from Euripides' Hippolytus. There's a near quotation of those lines in order to encourage Socrates to engage with Hippias. I can come back to this if anyone is interested, but I note that the Euripidean references may be appropriate for members of the Socratic circle, given the ancient evidence of an intellectual relationship between Euripides and Socrates. Scholarly evaluations of that evidence are, of course, there's controversy regarding its reliability, but it would be appropriate if there were in fact such a relationship. In both of the dialogues, the action is driven by a boast on the part of the sophist to be able to answer any question asked of him. that ability is treated in each case as a function of the sophist's talent for display speeches. And in both dialogues, I'll just say the boast is later recalled as a means for keeping the sophist engaged in the conversation at a point when it threatens to break down. And finally, in both dialogues, Socrates' initial questioning involves multiple examples drawn from the techni. In Gorgias, it's the elusive nature of Gorgias's activity that demands this. In Hippias Minor, it's Hippias's reluctance to admit defeat and his continual attempt to qualify his assent to the point Socrates is making to the example that's presently at issue. So each conversation ends up being a reflection on a central feature of the techni, and that becomes quite important for both dialogues. The significance of these parallels is, I suggest, that Plato is inviting us to examine in conjunction the conversations with Hippias and Gorgias. The two sophists are to be treated as companion figures in the sense that, taken together, Socrates' conversations with them offer an extended meditation on the skill involved in deception. If we conceive of that skill as a misrepresenting of the facts, then reliable false speaking will become important, as is emphasized in Hippias Minor. And the overall point will be that the purported skill of false speaking dissolves into a mastery of whatever domain is at issue. If we think of the skill involved in deception in terms of a persuasive ability that is indifferent to truth and falsehood, it will consist in a mastery of certain deceptive wiles that for Socrates do not constitute a techne, as of course we learn in Gorgias. What we have then is effectively a dilemmatic structure to Plato's treatment of deception, which is signaled at the dramatic level by the parallels between the two dialogues. So I propose Plato understands clearly the objection I'm making, and between the two dialogues, he offers his own response. I might add that this strategy of reading the dialogues in conjunction with one another remains relatively unexplored in Platonic studies, perhaps because the perspectives of the author Plato and the character Socrates are often simply identified with one another. But I think that the approach deserves further exploration, and I'm fairly confident that other instances of it could be found. But where does that leave us with respect to the character Socrates? It would be altogether too much to imagine that Hippias Minor is set right after Gorgias and that Socrates is somehow nodding in this dialogue to his earlier conversation with the other sophist. So is Socrates then benighted here, and are we engaged in saving the dialogue at the expense of its central character? My answer is no, for a simple reason. Socrates is not really concerned to analyze the deceptive ability that Hippias ascribes to Odysseus. Instead, he's doing something quite different with the conversation, namely communicating with the audience members who have remained after Hippias's display speech. We're told by Eutychus at the beginning of the dialogue that the remaining audience members are those who could best claim a role in philosophical discussion. Hoi malistan antipoies symetha metenai heimin tes en philosophia diatribes. The language used here is standard in Plato for members of the Socratic circle, and this is one of the reasons I earlier maintained that Eutychus is a Socratic. Another reason is Socrates immediately following acknowledgement of a sustained association with Eutychus's father, which is plausibly viewed as supporting the idea that he and Eutychus are very well acquainted. If anyone wants to explore that issue further, I'm happy to talk more about it in the question period. I'd also be happy to address the testimony of Hippias Major, which contains a well-known linking passage to Hippias Minor, but doesn't refer to Eutychus's relationship with Socrates. So please go ahead and ask me if you'd like to talk that through. But if this suggestion is right, and if it's the followers of Socrates who are listening to the conversation, then I propose that Socrates is using it for a specific purpose, namely to set a problem for his followers to consider. As I understand him, Socrates conceives of moral knowledge as a techne, and that idea governs the way in which the argument unfolds, with Achilles' purported goodness and Odysseus's purported badness being examined in the context of the techni. With his argument against Hippias, Socrates is bringing to the fore a problem regarding the nature of a techne. It is that the expert in a given techne best knows not only how to produce the good, the desirable outcome typically pursued by practitioners of the techne, but also the corresponding badness, the undesirable outcome the expert usually seeks to avoid, but may pursue on some occasions for special reasons. For instance, a doctor's poisoning a hated dictator in order to free the city of such a character. In some work Rusty Jones and I have done together, we've called this for convenience the bivalence thesis. In Hippias Minor, Socrates clearly thinks of bivalence as a feature of every techne, and indeed of every capacity. It belongs to the techni insofar as they are instances of capacities, dynames. That's what the second dialectical argument of the dialogue is largely securing. I read the dialogue as a whole as a challenge to Socrates' associates to think about why, given that the moral techne too is bivalent, there are no good people who intentionally act unjustly. There are interesting things to be said about the solution Socrates envisions, but that's not my purpose here. It's instead to propose that the action of the dialogue is best read in such a way that Socrates is using Hippias as a foil to pose a problem for his associates, where the problem arises from their common embrace of the techne model of moral knowledge. That's not to deny that Socrates is also interested in making Hippias aware of how poorly conceived Hippias's own ideas are, but Socrates is not doing what he does primarily with an eye to Hippias's welfare. To underscore the force of what I'm saying, let me add that the approach I'm taking here is directly contrary to what Julia Annis has suggested about Socratic argument in her recent talk for this group back in October, I think, where she said, Socrates argues against positions that other people defend without using positive views of his own that he argues from or defends. My stance is that such a characterization is untrue of Hippias Minor. I think it probably untrue of some other shorter Platonic dialogues as well. And I might add that taking it to be true would immediately drive a wedge between the characterization of Socrates in Plato and what one finds in at least most of the Socratic conversations in Xenophon, where Socrates does defend positive views of his own. I don't consider the conversations depicted by the two authors to be so alien as that characterization would suggest, though that's obviously a matter for another time. For now, let me just end here by suggesting that once the perspective I've offered on Socrates' goal in the dialogue is combined with the earlier observation about the dramatic links between Hippias Minor and Gorgias, we have a complete answer as to why the work's initial conversation takes the shape that it does. Thanks everybody for listening.
All right, I'll clap on behalf of the muted group. And as those of you who've done this series before know, we use the raise your hand function under reactions for indicating that you have a question or comment. And I invite you to do that now. Hugh?
Hi, Ravi.
Hi,
Good to
Hugh.
hear your paper. I thought it was really good and really clear, and I'm fairly convinced. There's something that I think you said at the beginning, and back when we were talking about when you were talking about the supposed fallacy of the first argument. And I think you suggested that palutropos, or maybe palutropia, is the capacity shared by both the truthful person and the false seeking person. And maybe I misunderstood that. So the first question is that what you think? And the second question is, if it is what you think, that would be great. I just wonder, is there any evidence that it's thought of as a dunamis palutropia? So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Let me see if I can address it. Feel free to follow up. I didn't mean to suggest that the term was used from the outset for a shared capacity, capacity shared by the artful true speaker and false speaker. My position was that Hippias introduces the term to describe the capacity he assigns to Odysseus, conceived as a malefactor, so it's a negatively valenced capacity. That's the way it's regarded at the outset of the dialogue, and it's over the course of the first argument and really at the argument's end that Socrates ends up suggesting that the relevant capacities are in fact the same. So in answer to your initial question, yeah, I would say something like this about Socrates' position at the end of the argument, but that's not the way the term gets used early in the dialogue, where it's introduced and used mainly by Hippias. And regarding the question whether there's evidence that the term is in fact used as a capacity term, I will say we can talk further about this if you like, but I do think that this is the way it's introduced at 364C of the dialogue. And I also think that at the beginning of the dialectical argument in the dialogue, at around 365D and E, the term gets reintroduced by Socrates in reference to the capacity for deception that Hippias has just described of the pseudes, the false speakers he's discussing. I don't know if that helps you.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Nick Smith?
Yeah. Oh, hi, Ravi.
Hi,
That
Nick.
was fun. That was great. Really interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit more about about what your suggestion is with respect to the sort of connection between the Hippias Minor and the Gorgias.
Yeah.
Which I found that a really interesting suggestion. And the evidence, that you present is also quite interesting, and I think probably bears further thought. But I guess my question is sort of how far we want to go with this. Maybe a pair of questions. One is, is this a suggestion somewhat like what Charles Kahn does with the dialogues, where they're Plato, in creating the one, had the other one in mind, either prospectively or retrospectively, and so they were really intended to be read in a certain order? Or is it just that, we're, as Socratics, we're supposed to see that there's a kind of clear connection stylistically between the two, and that should key us into maybe similar things are going on? And then on the skeptical side, I guess what I wanted to ask is this, that, I mean, why wouldn't it just be something we might expect about a portrait of a Socratic dialogue with a sophist, that there might be these certain kinds of things in common? I was thinking about the ones that you listed, and I was trying to think about how many of those would also apply to the discussion with Protagoras in the dialogue of that name. And I'm just wondering if rather than there being some very specific tight connection that scholars should be attending to, that this is really just more a kind of handy dandy series of ways in which we can depict Socrates at work with some sophist.
Thanks for those questions, Nick. Let me try and offer a response. And if I don't get everything in that you asked, please just remind me and I'll try and come back to it. First of all, I take your point, and there might be a few of these connections that are shared with other dialogues, but really the dramatic framing where Socrates misses an epideixis by the sophist, or fails to engage, I should say, and it's a student of his who proposes remedying the situation and then intervenes with the sophist and so on, going through the things that I raised. I think they're really specific to Hippias Minor and Gorgias, and I think it's quite striking that the two dialogues begin in very similar ways, and that the professions of Hippias and Gorgias are described in nearly identical language. And I don't think that's just down to the fact that they are sophists. One could, of course, suppose that Plato, let me imagine that Hippias Minor was written first, and one could suppose that Plato repurposed a favorite dramatic device at the beginning of Gorgias. That's of course possible, but given the ancient evidence for the fondness Plato had for tinkering with the dialogues and revising them, I think that if he left this similarity in place between the dialogues, it was probably there for a purpose. I don't think that necessarily implies that he had a plan to write both dialogues in some fashion, at least when he wrote the first of them. It could well be the case that in the context of writing Hippias Minor, again, let's just suppose for the sake of discussion that it's first, in the context of writing this dialogue, he was really thinking of deceptive skill in terms of false speaking. And then in later reflecting on the issue of deception, he came to think, that could be right for a certain construal of deception, but there are all these other deceptive practices that I haven't engaged with. Let me say what I have to say about those in the context of another drama, and let me signal its links to the earlier drama by repeating some of these dramatic devices. So I don't think that this proposal commits us to any particular idea of Plato's intentionality as an author with respect to what dialogues he's going to write, or certainly at what times. Have I responded to the questions, or am I still missing a piece of what you were asking, Nick?
If you've missed any pieces, I've lost them too at this point. So no, I think that was fine.
I do have a talent for talking at length and making people forget what their questions were. So, yeah, good.
Jeff Parno?
Hi, this is a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm out of the loop, generally speaking, but I love to get back in. I've written a book about, it's called Propositional Perception, which uses in the first chapter the sequence of Theaetetus and Sophist, the Socratic dialogues or the Platonic dialogues that clearly pass the baton on from Socrates to another leader speaker. And my point there is a little bit across the intention of the dialogues, because I'm trying to extract a kind of doctrine from them, which is set up. It has to do with the creation, as I argue, in the Theaetetus, of the term fantasia as a kind of a booby trap. And it has to do with Socrates, or Plato's rather, establishment of certain things about a proposition and about the parallel between fantasia, doxazein, and legein, which are treated in both dialogues as a kind of succession. In other words, the same phenomenon of making a claim. And so this is, I'm very interested in the fact that Plato does provide the basis for Stoic logic. That's what's happening in those dialogues. Not that he's intending to do that, of course not. But the point is that as a byproduct of the arguments that he develops to deal with the sophists, we have an armature of talking about how, and of course, the fantasia for Plato is always going to get you in trouble. But the Stoics basically are, that's the best we've got. Now, I'm really fascinated with what you did, however, with the Hippias Minor, because I have also written a book about the Odyssey. And I use the passages in Plato where he cites scenes of deliberation from Homer for his tripartite scheme of the mind, about how deliberation works, and whether there's a hierarchy of faculties, whether there's an irrational faculty, so forth. So what fascinated me about yours, your talk just now, and many things, but particularly this, that it's a kind of Homeric criticism, but it's oblique. In other words, you're not presenting it as an argument about what is Homer doing, but it's a great argument about what Homer's doing. Aristotle later on has a passage in the Poetics where he says Homer teaches us how to lie. It's a passage which is analyzing dialogue between a disguised Odysseus and Penelope. And I actually disagree with Aristotle there that he misinterprets that passage, because we don't know what the tears that are the result of the dialogue mean. I think it is clear that Penelope has not been fooled. But anyway, I think the argument about polytropos or polutropos, Socrates is offering us an intelligent view, which is that being able to lie is sometimes crucial, and that the real techne that Odysseus masters is strategic, or even just tactical lying. You don't, and he learns that in the course of the Odyssey. That is to say, first he's very happy to blurt out the truth and to even boast of it. Later on, he says that's not the way to approach most situations, whether it's talking to potential enemies or to your wife that you want to keep duping because you don't want her to spill the beans. So anyway, you can see that your talks set off lots of things in my mind. And it was really wonderful. And I think your exposition is excellent.
Thanks very much for your comments. I look forward to checking out your work on both Plato and the Odyssey. Just a couple of very quick points regarding linkages between the dialogues. I agree that there are many more than I have cited here. I think that there are some other connections of Hippias Minor with works in the Platonic corpus. There's also the connection of this dialogue with the work of other Socratic writers. There's a long fragment of Antisthenes, fragment 187, in the Genetoni numbering, where there's a discussion of what Homer might have meant in calling Odysseus Palutropos, and that's has a long tradition of scholarly discussion, and I'll be talking about that some in the book. And there's Xenophon's Memorabilia 4.2, which deals with, at one point, with a puzzle that's similar to the central puzzle in the first argument here of the dialogue. So there are all kinds of connections to be explored here, and I am very much behind that. I'll just mention, with respect to the Odyssey, a view that I have about the dialogue. I'm happy to return to this if anyone would like, but I think that Hippias is being cast as a poor interpreter of Homer in the dialogue. I didn't get into that in the talk because it involves some larger conversations and conversations about other episodes in the dialogue, but I think the question of the use of Homer in this work is a fascinating one. So thanks again.
Yeah. Thank
Paul,
you.
what-
Is it my turn?
Yeah,
Yes.
Paul.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I'm very pleased to hear you performing in this elegant way. I think I agree with you that Hippias is not really interpreting the Odyssey. I think he's probably referring to the way in which Odysseus is represented in the contemporary 5th century culture. And probably most likely Euripides. I think, again, you're quite right to point out the connection with Euripides. And in Euripides, Odysseus is an out-and-out villain, especially in the Trojan Women. He is the most vicious of the Greeks. Against that background, it seems to me very unlikely that any reasonable person could suppose that the techne Odysseus is employing in the Trojan Women is a moral techne, because it's plainly represented by Euripides as vicious. And that's one of many reasons why I think I tend to agree with Annis and Weiss and some others that the Hippias Minor is really more like a reductio of the idea that there can be such a thing as a moral techne, according to Socrates. So I think it's important to bring out the 5th century background attitude towards Odysseus, which I think shades the argument in a different way from the way that you're pushing it.
Thank you, Paul. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. And thank you for your question. I'll have to think more about this. I am familiar with the 5th century background, and this is, of course, also a common scholarly view that there's a growing negative portrayal of Odysseus in tragedy as the 5th century comes to a close, and some people have connected it with the debacle that Athens increasingly faces in the Peloponnesian War and the way in which political oratory has led the city astray. But one piece that I think is crucial to keep in view here and also to account for is the appropriation of Odysseus by Socratic writers, including writers apart from Plato. There are passages in both Xenophon and Antisthenes that I take to be positive depictions of Odysseus, and in fact, interpretations of Odysseus as if Odysseus were a kind of proto-Socratic figure in his abilities. And I think that what one finds in the Socratic writers is a kind of reappropriation of the figure of Odysseus as a way of giving cultural legitimation to the style of doing philosophy that they took Socrates to represent. And I don't want to say that there is that my interpretation implies that one should give a positive reading to the Odysseus figure in the Hippias Minor, or that Odysseus is represented as a kind of counterpart to Socrates. That's a feature of some interpretations. It's not really an important feature of my interpretation, but I do take Socrates seriously in the dialogue when he says, just after the end of the first argument, when he says to Hippias, look, I thought that Achilles and Odysseus were both aristo, both best. And I don't take that to be out of keeping with what we find in the Socratic literature. So I think this may be a point at which Plato disagrees with some of the portrayals in tragedy. But I will give some more thought to that.
Thank you.
Okay, Christopher Raymond.
Hi, Ravi. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Chris. Great to see you.
Good to see you. I wanted to follow up on what you were saying toward the end about the relationship between Plato and the character Socrates and the historical Socrates, and see if I've got your view right. So the way I understood it was that the historical Socrates held that virtue was a techne, and that the Socratic circle had picked up this idea, and that Plato is using the Hippias Minor in conjunction with the Gorgias, maybe other dialogues, to critique this notion, or at least to get the other Socratics to reflect on the consequences of holding that view. That's what I understood. And then my question is your view that Plato's character Socrates in the dialogue also holds that view, or maybe he's criticizing the historical Socrates view, or how exactly are you understanding the relationship there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Let me say a couple of things about this, and please feel free to follow up. So I didn't mean in the context of the talk to make any claims about the historical Socrates. I was really talking about the compositional practice of the author Plato and of the commitments of the character Socrates in the dialogue. And I do read the dialogue in such a way that he embraces the techne analogy, and I read other dialogues in such a way that he does as well, though I know that not everyone in this group would likely follow me in that. So at the level of the talk, I was just attempting to make claims about these two, the character Socrates and the author Plato. In the question period, it's true that in referring to the work of other Socratic writers, I was talking about what Socrates was doing. One could look at this, I suppose, in several ways. One could think of them as having a common depiction of their characters named Socrates as part of a shared intellectual project, or one could alternatively think of them as reflecting something about the historical Socrates. If you ask me to be incautious and to tell you what my impulse is, what I'm tempted to say here, I would be tempted to say something about the historical Socrates. That's partly because one thrust of the work that Rusty Jones and I have done on Xenophon Socratic writings is to argue that there's that the idea of a fundamental divergence between Xenophon and Plato as regards some of the core commitments, the core philosophical commitments of Socrates, their character Socrates, is largely illusory, at least for the issues that we've discussed. And we have raised the possibility that, in fact, these works can allow us to make certain inferences about the historical Socrates, contrary to what has commonly been thought. So I'm not unfriendly to that sort of a proposal, but I didn't mean it to be part of the thesis of the talk.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. So one way you're differentiating yourself from other readings is that you take Socrates to be committed to the view of virtue as a techne in the Hippias Minor, as opposed to critiquing Hippias's, drawing out and critiquing Hippias's view, say. Okay, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I do think he's critical of things that Hippias says and that he's attacking a view that Hippias holds, but I think he's actually doing it in the service of reflecting on a problem that arises for the idea of virtue as a techne and recommending to his friends and followers that they think about this and work on it, and setting it as a project for them, in other words, to think about what philosophical commitments they would have to have in order to continue to think of virtue as a techne. I don't think of the dialogue as critiquing that idea.
Other questions or comments? In that case, thank you all for coming, and hope to see you at the Socrates Colloquium in 2 weeks. And more applause on behalf of the muted group for our speaker, and thanking him for a very stimulating and interesting, clear talk.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your attending, and feel free to follow up with me if you have any thoughts or questions.